hopefully. Hang on, I'm on the wrong place. There we go. Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 12. As always, to give people time to get here and join the stream and what have you, I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made vain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard do go and check out his channel on YouTube. If you like good music and you like music from people who are on the right politically, Chris is your bloke. Go and check him out. Good evening, Aaron. How are you going this evening?
Oh, well, Rick, how are you?
Not bad. We may have another guest joining us in about half an hour who has been on my channel before, but not for a long time. Really good guy. He's a member of my Discord, has been for years now, and hopefully he'll be joining us about 10 o'clock. Anyway, we're going to be talking about the Washington Naval Treaty this evening. People who follow the channel will know that a couple of weeks ago we did the Anglo-German naval race from 1900 onwards. At the end, and of course, you've really got to go back to Trafalgar in 1805. It was the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, along with Nelson's other great victories at the Nile and Copenhagen, and the Royal Navy's victories generally, which gave Britain command of the oceans of the world. And that was obviously vital because the British Empire was all over the world, basically. It was a third of the world and about a quarter of the world's population. And so, command of the world's oceans was absolutely essential for the British Empire because it was a maritime empire. Britain had the biggest navy in the world all through the 19th century. And at the end of World War I, Britain had about 42 dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers. That was despite war losses. We lost, I can't remember, I think it was 4 or 5 dreadnoughts and battle cruisers during the war. But at the end of it, we had 42 of them. The German Navy surrendered to the Royal Navy and then scuttled itself at Scapa Flow, which was the most aggressive, was the most useful thing they probably did in the whole war. It was the German High Seas Fleet was a complete waste of time for Germany. It was a complete waste of time and money and effort. And as I say, at the end of the war, the sailors mutinied, and the ships surrendered to the Royal Navy, and then the German sailors scuttled the ships, or the German officers rather, really scuttled the ships, and that was the end of the German High Seas Fleet. And that meant the second biggest navy in the world was the American Navy, which in 1921 had 21 dreadnoughts. So the Brits had 42 and the Americans had 21, which was exactly half as many as the Brits had. Aaron, you're our political guy. So would you like to do some talking about the British politics immediately after World War One?
Yeah, now Lloyd George has promised. He's been promised since December 1916. There was a sort of
a liberal for the people in the chat. He was a lefty liberal, basically.
Yeah, he'd been, but the Liberals have been in power since 1906. They'd been a minority government since 1910. When the war started, they remained solely a Liberal government. Then in 1915, they formed a coalition with Conservatives and at that point, a very small Labour Party. The Prime Minister of the day at that point is Asquith. He had been Prime Minister since 1908. And then in December 1916, Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister because he is, frankly, more able than Asquith to do the job. And as Prime Minister, during wartime, he's very effective. He is able sort of to focus the British state on winning the war, though not without many faults. I mean, he is the reason why when the March offensive, the spring offensive of 1918 takes place, it starts in March.
Yes.
The British Army on the Western Front is doesn't have as much troops as he wants because he does not want to send them.
This is the Kaiser battle, as the Germans called it. which was their one chance of winning the war before enough Americans got involved.
Yeah.
And as Aaron is correctly saying, the British Army was very short of troops because Lloyd George would not send reinforcements over to the BEF. But carry on, Aaron, please.
Yeah. Now, so he is 1988. The 1918 general election takes place in December 1918. The election is run as a coalition. So the Liberal Party has at this point split, and so Asquith is out on the opposition benches with half the Liberal Party, and the other half has remained with Lloyd George. So this is what is called a coupon election. So where a coupon saying you're endorsed by the coalition to a Liberal candidate is sent out, and the coupon, the coalition wins, but the Conservatives are overwhelmingly are the majority of the coalition, and the Lloyd George Liberals or the coupon Liberals are very much a minority. And this means that when Lloyd George is Prime Minister from 1918 onwards in his post-war coalition, he is trying to establish a new party out to the ruins of the Liberal Party called the United Constitutional Party, where he's doing this by trying to merge with the Tories, and he's selling honours at about 1,000, starting with knighthoods of £1,000 a pop, which in the early 1920s was a hell of a lot of money. And so you've got that going on. He is trying to keep himself in power where it means possible. At the same time, the British government is sort of going through a period of retrenchment. You had the Geddes Acts sort of trying to cut waste in the British government. And also the British government is the Royal Navy and the Admiralty and the War Office are both looking at the post-war sort of world for essentially empire policing. And so you've got things like the Singapore strategy in the Far East, where the object is to build effectively a Gibraltar of the Far East of Singapore and use that as a way to defend British interests in the Far East in conjunction with the Japanese. And so that is going on. There is also
Aaron, a couple of things. Can I first of all answer Duke Valentino in the chat and say, first of all, half the Navy was never Irish, not even during Nelson's period. That a lot of the army was Irish, but even in the army, it was about a third, not more than that. But the Navy was much less Irish for one reason, that sailors were quite skilled. You had to know what you were doing to be a sailor and to handle the sails and go up the mast and all this kind of stuff. And so most sailors were quite skilled guys. The infamous press gangs, for example, were really only supposed to get sailors, and they were only allowed to operate within about 10 miles of the coast and in major ports like London and Bristol and Glasgow and places like that. So no, not much of the Navy was ever Irish, actually. But anyway, the other thing I would just say is if people have questions they would like to ask, you can send us a super chat via Entropy. It's pinned at the top of the chat. And we will answer anything that people send us on those things. The other thing I was just going to say is that also after World War I finished, they sent the commander of the Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland, they sent Admiral Jellicoe all around the empire to assess what needed to be done and what improvements needed to be made. And it was Jellicoe partly who said, look, we need a base in the Far East. And to my mind, the Brits would have been better off setting up in Australia. But the reason they didn't is because Australia was an independent dominion. And in Singapore, which was a crown colony, they could do anything they liked. Whereas if they'd have done it in, say, Sydney, they would have had to have consulted the Australian government. But that's all I had to say, Aaron, so you carry on.
No, thank you. Now, at the same time, going back to something we discussed last
Hang on 1 second. Duke Valentino, the Navy was never majority Irish. It was never even half Irish. Ireland is not noted for its sailors. I have to tell you, mate, it's not. All right. Sorry, Al. Beg your pardon.
So just going back to something we spoke about in last week's episode, you had the Anglo-Irish War, the Irish War of Independence going on. So that was very much pressing on the government right at that point. The unions were acting up. There were strikes, and there was a threat of what was called the Triple Alliance, which was the miners, the dockers, and the railwaymen all going on strike. That had been a threat in 1914. They were doing that. That was another threat. And so this was also sort of racking government. And then there's also Lloyd George's personality. He is in many ways sort of a model for many future prime ministers when handling foreign affairs, which is he tries to go around the Foreign Office. Before Lloyd George, the Foreign Office is very much, in many ways, a sort of independent kingdom where the Foreign Secretary very much handles foreign affairs. This sort of met its apogee under Lloyd George's predecessor Asquith with Edward Grey at the Foreign Office, where he was acting independently, essentially, of the cabinet, with the only members of the cabinet knowing what's going on.
Aaron, am I right in saying that when Lord Salisbury was Prime Minister, he was also Foreign Secretary, wasn't he?
Yeah, yes, he was, and actually that is true for Ramsay MacDonald, who became Prime Minister in 1924. He also takes on the post. So there were occasions with those were elements of where the Prime Minister and where the Prime Minister also take over the role of Foreign Secretary. Though I should say, even then, because of the nature of things, that usually the day-to-day business of running the Foreign Office is left to the I've forgotten the minister, what would now be the Minister of State of the Foreign Office. So in Salisbury's government, that was actually at least until 1900, Lord Curzon, who actually I'm going to bring up because at the time in the post-war coalition government, Curzon was the Foreign Secretary. He was an extremely good Foreign Secretary, arguably one of the best, if not the best Foreign Secretary.
What was it they used to say, Aaron? They used to say, "My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a very superior person."
Yeah. And to be honest, he very much was. He was a deeply intelligent man, as a brilliant
Viceroy of India at one stage, I believe.
Absolutely, yeah, 1900 to 1905. And there he was absolutely brilliant as Viceroy, and he should have become Prime Minister, but he was stopped thanks to the reach of George V's Private Secretary, Lord Stanford, and the iniquities of Stanley Baldwin and his friend J.T.C. Davidson. However, that's for another time. But Curzon is Foreign Secretary. He's very effective, but Lloyd George is very much wanting to grab the reins of power when it comes to handling foreign affairs. So he's constantly intervening, constantly getting the backup of foreign leaders. And noticeably, you see this in about 10 months after just over a year after the Washington Naval Conference, which produces the treaty, happens when you have the Çanak crisis in Turkey, where Lloyd George succeeds in pissing off the French president, as well as most of the Dominion prime ministers, by trying to almost cause a war in favour of the Greeks against the Turks. Actually intervened properly in the Greco-Turkish war at that point.
Well, of course, again, that was a traditional liberal thing that they supported the Greeks over the Turks.
Yeah, and that actually causes the end of the coalition itself with the very famous October 1922 Carlton meeting. However, and so there's a big tension in the run up to the naval, in the Washington Naval Conference between Lloyd George and Curzon, and one of the reasons why Curzon is not at the naval conference in Washington is because Lloyd George wants to effectively handle it himself at one remove. And so instead of sending Curzon, he sends the former Prime Minister and Curzon's immediate predecessor, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, to head up the British delegation.
It's the divine Arthur again, yes.
Yeah, he's one of the worst British Prime Minister of the 20th century. Not the worst, but one of the worst. Because he has one or two saving graces. For example, he sets up the Imperial Committee of Defence and sort of does do various reform.
The Committee of Imperial, the Imperial Defence Committee was quite important. One of the things I would like to point out, mainly for the chat, is that Britain at the end of World War One was not in the same position as Britain was at the end of World War Two. At the end of World War Two, Britain had been bankrupt for 2 or 3 years. Britain was not at all bankrupt at the end of World War One. Britain was much poorer than it had been, and we owed the Americans money. But at the same time, the French and the Belgians and other European countries also owed Britain money. And what I think happened, and I'm sure Aaron knows more about this than me, is that most of the European countries defaulted on their loans to Britain. And partly as a result of that, Britain defaulted on its loan to the Americans. Would that be fair, Aaron?
Yes, very much so. It was the whole thing was effectively balanced on everybody being able to pay their loans. And it should be pointed out that the British government in the interwar period was really good when it came to dealing with the debt and servicing the interest on the debt. But they were in a situation where they were relying on, so we say, less than faithful partners in Europe, especially the Germans. One of the sort of great myths of the interwar period is that the Germans couldn't afford to pay their reparations, but actually could. And in fact, the economic crisis they suffered at the end of the 20s is not caused by the Great Depression, but caused by their own mismanagement of their economy, and especially the government spending. And so, the British government, they end up defaulting on their debt along with quite a few other nations. Then Britain does have immense difficulty with dealing with the Americans. And of course, added to this is the fact that when, after the events we're talking about, Stanley Baldwin, who is then Chancellor of the Exchequer, goes over in late 1923 to the United States to negotiate the debt repayments, and he gives in to the Americans. And when he comes back, the then Prime Minister Andrew Bonar Law, who is, although he doesn't know it at the time, is in the process of is on the verge of dying of throat cancer, is absolutely horrified. His son had died during the First World War, and he actually contemplates resigning as Prime Minister in protest of what Baldwin's done. He doesn't, and Britain is then saddled with these massive debt repayments, though the British, I should say, do so. And chancellors throughout the interwar period are extremely good in doing this against all sort of outside pressures and the unfaithfulness of the.
Britain is paying its debts off relatively easily after World War One, and as I say, one of the things that many people get wrong is they think Britain after World War One is as skint as it was after World War Two, and it wasn't. Not at all. Britain was in nowhere near such a bad financial position as we were in 1945, in 1918. Britain was still a rich nation. We had squandered a lot of treasure on World War One, but basically we were still a pretty rich nation. And this is important when we come to talk about the Washington Naval Treaty in a bit. But do carry on, Aaron. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, it's quite right. And one thing I would add is the economy wasn't doing very well. The British economy doesn't really fully recover from the First World War until essentially the mid-30s. But that's had one upside, which is when the Great Depression happens. Britain is not very hard hit, really. And it recovers quite fast, especially when you compare to the United States, where they had a wonderful sort of booming decade of the Roaring 20s. And then that comes to a shuddering halt in 29 and 30, and they are really hard. Whereas
the Americans suffered worse than we did in the Great Depression, because the Americans only really got out of the Great Depression when World War II started.
Yeah,
Whereas Britain got out of it in the 1930s. And if you want proof of that, if you wander around many parts of England, for example, you will see these lovely 1930s houses, which are very desirable these days. And those 1930s houses were the houses that were built as Britain was getting out of the Depression.
Yeah, in fact, Britain, starting from about 36 onwards, not only recovers from the Great Depression, it enters an economic boom, which is only brought to an end by the Second World War. The country is, by the late 30s, not only is it out of the Great Depression, it's in the best state it's been since the end of the First World War. So far better, as you mentioned, than the Americans, and far better than most nations in Europe. And
so you people in the chat, you mustn't get this impression that after World War One in 1919, Britain is completely broke. Not true at all. This is important to understand, and it's very important to understand when we start talking about the Washington Naval Treaty. But carry on, Aaron.
Yeah, and so Britain has some financial difficulties with its debt, but it's very much dealing with them. It has some economic. It isn't not in the best economic shape, but still, it's far much better than it would have been after 1945. And the government, financially speaking, under I think it's Reginald McKenna, who is the Chancellor, released from I think 20 onwards. He is very effective in keeping these things going, and so the country, I just mentioned, financially, economically, isn't in the best shape, but it's still a rich country, and things are being handled well. Within politics, as I mentioned, you've got the war in Ireland. There's effectively a civil war in Ireland going on. And then of course India is starting to become a factor with Gandhi's campaign starting there, and so there's a sense of sort of unifying the empire, and part of this is done through mentioning things like the Singapore strategy, and with the establishment of, as I said, the Singapore station, which is never actually fully completed. The seaward side is completed, but the land defences are never properly completed. And that is because there is a sort of stop and start with the construction, where when Labour comes in 1924, Ramsay MacDonald stops it. Then when the Conservatives come back in, they restart it. Then when Labour comes back in 29, they stop it again, and then it gets started again by the National Government in the 30s. And so,
also worth mentioning, Aaron, that when was Winston Churchill Chancellor of the Exchequer?
He was Chancellor in Baldwin's government after 24, so that would have been, I think he was appointed in some point in 25, and he's there until 29 when Labour come in.
He was responsible for not providing Singapore with a lot of money. Like he cut the amount that the Royal Navy were allowed to spend there quite severely. And Winston Churchill himself did that. And then in World War II turned around and claimed he didn't realise there were no land defences. But he knew damn well there weren't, because he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer who stopped them building them. But anyway,
the entire British, essentially the British political leadership between the wars, in many ways, just failed with with sort of empire defences. They, with the exception of people like Leo Amery, who had some idea of what to do, a lot of them they didn't have pretty much a clue of how to handle things, and it was great. And Churchill was, frankly, though Churchill contributed to it, I very much regard somebody like Stanley Baldwin or Ramsay MacDonald to be far more guilty in contributing to that, given they were.
Well, I mean, also we had the 10-year rule, of course, which was extended every year. And the 10-year rule, for anyone who doesn't know, was that there won't be a major war for 10 years. And that's fine if you do that in 1919. But the problem was they extended it every year.
Yeah, and also one thing we should mention at this point is sort of the anti-war feeling in the country after the First World War. The idea of never again when it comes to going to war is part of what, of course, it motivates the.
That didn't work out too well, did it?
No, it did not, and it's absolutely ridiculous. Now, I can understand having a scepticism towards going to war on the continent again, given the experience of the First World War, but that wasn't the feeling. It was an absolute opposition to rearmament as a whole. For example, in 1934, 34, there was a suggestion by the national government they will begin a process of very limited rearmament. There was a by-election immediately after this announcement where a candidate put up by the Peace Pledge Union wins this on a platform of opposing rearmament wholesale.
I think at some stage, Aaron, we'll do one of these streams on appeasement, right?
Yeah.
Which was actually not anywhere near as bad as some people think it was, but we will do a stream on that at some point. Yeah. But I'm just noting this is taking us a long way ahead from 1922. I'd like to try and get us back to the period from the end of the First World War in November 1918 and 1922, because that's the main thing we're going to be talking about. And I think one of the things you have to know is that one of Britain's allies, and a very good ally, and had been an ally since 1902, was the Japanese. The Japanese Navy escorted Australian and New Zealand troops from the Pacific to the Middle East. The Japanese captured the German base at Tsingtao and treated the German prisoners of war very well, by the way. They went home fatter than when they were captured. The Japanese also sent squadrons of destroyers into the Mediterranean to help the Royal Navy in World War I. They were a very good ally. And they were Britain's oldest ally in terms of in the 20th century. Obviously, the oldest of all British allies was Portugal, but they, long time ago. But the Japanese were the oldest 20th century British ally. And this was also quite important after World War I. The Japanese Navy was very largely modelled on the Royal Navy. In fact, we even built quite a lot of their warships in Britain. Carry on, Aaron, sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. There's very strong, after the establishment of the alliance, there was a very strong sort of popular pro-Japanese feeling in Britain. The Japanese were regarded very highly. They were regarded as sort of fellow island race, fellow sort of martial race, and you see this in the contrast between the view of the Chinese and the Japanese, where during the Russo-Japanese War, the British very much the Royal Navy officer was attached to the Japanese Navy at the time. I can't remember.
There were Royal Navy officers attached to the Navy, and there were also British Army observers with the Japanese Army in Manchuria.
Yeah, and I can't remember if it was an army, whether it was an army officer or naval officer who was attached to the Japanese, but he was sending reports back, and he was clearly identifying the British with the Japanese, and very much identifying not just the Russians, not just as the Japanese enemy, but as the British enemy. And so
one of the officers, Aaron, with the Japanese army in Manchuria was actually Ian Hamilton, who was the guy in charge of Gallipoli.
The sort of Anglo-Japanese alliance was, as you say, very important. The Japanese were a very close ally, and it was very sort of integrated between the sort of British and the Japanese in terms of their armed forces, in terms of their sort of their military cooperation. Yeah. As you mentioned, during World War I, they were serving with us in the Mediterranean. They did extremely well wherever they fought, and I should point out that the Japanese, not only did they model their navy on the Royal Navy, they modelled actually their constitution and their political system on the British system in many ways. They were very much emulating the British constitutional monarchy system, and many of the senior politicians, especially the prime ministers and the foreign ministers, were deeply influenced by British, particularly British politics, particularly conservative politics, and so they were very much modelling themselves on people like Salisbury, and modelling the sort of trying to update the Japanese Japan along British lines with a bit of German influence. Mostly in terms of the welfare state that Bismarck established, but the rest was very much British in terms of their when we enter this sort of post-war era of 1918 to 1922, Japan is firmly on Britain's side and pretty much stays on Britain's side until the late 30s, though there are difficulties caused by the Naval Washington Treaty. And
well, yeah, we're going to come on to talk about that just now, Aaron. But yeah, I think you've kind of set the scene politically reasonably well. And as I say, do not imagine that Britain is broke. It's not. Yes, it has some financial problems, but it's by no means broke. And I still can't work out why Britain agreed to this at all, and I'm hoping Aaron will be able to tell me, because he's more into the politics of that era than I am. I know quite a lot about the naval and military history. I know less about the politics, particularly between 1918 and 1922, 23. That is not my specialty at all. So. Aaron, why do you think the British government was receptive to the idea of basically scrapping half the Royal Navy?
Part of it, I think, was the government, particularly Lloyd George, was trying to foster an alliance with the Americans, trying to continue that from the end of the First World War, which didn't really succeed because British and American interests did not align at that point. In fact, British and American interests until essentially the Second World War didn't really align at all. And you could argue
they didn't even align in the Second World War. But I mean, yeah, no. But this was. I mean, the Americans made it very clear that they were not interested in an alliance at all.
Yeah.
They made that very, very clear, and yet still the British government goes along with this nonsense.
Yeah, I think also part of it is trying to get on the good side of the Americans with the upcoming debt negotiations over payments. Because whilst, as we said before, Britain wasn't a poor country and was still very much able to deal with its debt, I think part of it stemmed from the fact they were trying to get the best position possible, though that obviously had no effect whatsoever, given what happens with Baldwin just over a year after the conference. And I think another part of it was a sort of general sense of, as Steve in the chat mentioned, not wanting to have another sort of an arms race, which they didn't think they could. Which I think they didn't think they could win. Though obviously that's sort of nonsense, and the Americans certainly couldn't have won one. But we'll probably come to that.
I think, Aaron, what you've got to be clear about when you look at this, right, is that Britain could, if she wanted to, in 1922, build 6 battleships in a year.
Yeah.
Right. Britain had so many shipyards, and they were really good. They had really skilled workforces. And they could build 6 battleships in a year if they wanted to. No other country in the world could do that, and that includes the United States in 1922. The United States used to build at most 2, or I think once they built 3 in a year, but mostly they built 2. Whereas Royal Navy battleship classes were generally laid down in classes of 4 or 5 ships.
Yeah, and also with Britain. Just at this point, comparing Britain and America in terms of the naval when it comes to building, that was obviously the speed at which Britain could build them was a factor, but also the fact that with Britain building ships was not seen as a political liability, as it were. That it was seen the Navy was obviously the first and up until pretty much the creation of the Britain getting its nuclear bomb in the early 50s, the last line of defence the country had, both defending the home islands and also defending the empire. Whereas in the United States, you had a lot of, particularly in the Midwest, very sort of anti sort of naval faction, because they saw it as a waste of time, because everyone retrieved the fact that the US was a huge country and it had two huge oceans either side of it, and they protected it. They didn't see why they needed to have a huge navy. And so,
and also let's point out that the Monroe Doctrine, the famous American Monroe Doctrine, all through the 19th century, the only reason the Monroe Doctrine stood was because of the Royal Navy. Actually, that was what stopped any European power interfering in the southern the other hemisphere was the Royal Navy, and it certainly wasn't the American Navy for most of the 19th century, which was tiny. And it wasn't even the American Army, which was also, apart from during the American Civil War, the American Army was also tiny for most of that time.
Oh yeah, for people who don't know, this is taking a bit forward, but when the Americans entered World War II, their army is smaller than, I think it's the peacetime army of Bulgaria, possibly. Some of the smaller European nations had larger armies than the US Army had at the outbreak of World War II. The army is absolutely tiny, and the Navy, whilst always somewhat bigger than the US Army, was also small as well. It only really gets big in terms of long-term strategy in the aftermath of the Second World War. But before that, the largest begins under Roosevelt with the Great White Fleet in the Edwardian era, and that sort of comes to an end pretty much in the 20s with sort of retrenchment and the United States going into isolation.
Indeed, absolutely true. So yeah, let's go back to 1922, and you have a Britain and also an America to some degree, which is America did very well out of World War I, basically by making munitions for the French and the British, ammunition and stuff like this. They sent quite a lot of troops to Europe by the end of the war, but very few of them actually saw action, relatively speaking. And so America did very well. If you come into a world war in the final year, you often do quite well. But personally, I wish Britain had done that. I wish we'd have stayed out of World War I and maybe come into it in 1917. Actually, no, because if the Brits hadn't been in World War I from the start, the French would have lost by probably 1915 or 1916 anyway. Yeah. If it had just been down to the French on their own, they would have lost the war, certainly by 1916. And I think that would have been the sensible thing for Britain to have done, to be honest. We should have declared an armed neutrality. We should have said, if the French fleet or the German fleet comes into the North Sea, we'll sink you. But other than that, we're totally neutral. And that would have been the best British policy, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm just saying that would have been the best policy for Britain. Also, it would have been, importantly, the French would have accepted that. They wouldn't have necessarily been happy about it, but they would have accepted it because it would, of course, have the Germans weren't going to be in the Channel. And so,
yeah, I mean, Churchill claimed, because Churchill was mad for war, because Churchill was always mad for any war. But he said, "Oh, we can't let the French down, but because we've agreed that we'll cover the English Channel and the North Sea." But if Britain had have declared armed neutrality and said, "If the German High Seas Fleet comes out, we'll sink you," that would have covered the French from the North Sea and the English Channel.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I am very happy to welcome Rupert August, who hasn't been on this channel for quite a long time, but he's an excellent chap, and I know he knows quite a lot of history around this period. Good evening, Rupert. How are you doing, mate?
Hello, doing well.
Excellent. I believe you became a dad not so long ago, didn't you?
Yes, indeed. Hence my scarcity around these parts.
Hope the child is doing really well.
Yeah, he's doing well. Developing very well.
Excellent, mate. That's excellent. We've not really started too much. We've been setting the scene in that Britain had some financial difficulties at the end of World War One, but wasn't anywhere near as broke as we were at the end of World War Two, of course. We could still build 6 battleships a year if we wanted to. We had the shipyards and the skilled guys to actually do that. And we've basically been kind of setting the scene to that. I don't know if you've heard any of it, but if you want to add something to that stuff about what was going on from 1918 to 1922, feel free, mate.
No, unfortunately, I haven't caught what you've talked about so far. But I think from what you've said, the only thing I'd potentially add that maybe has an effect. To be honest, this is speculative based on what I know about around the area, not necessarily something I've read in particular. But I know the Anglophilia was kind of in the ascendant, especially after, like immediately after World War One in America, because there'd been the sort of anti-hyphenated American movement, which was the charge was basically led by Anglophiles and Anglo-Americans. So there was kind of a rallying around Anglo identity, and a lot of the leaders were still, very Anglophilic and Anglo-American, like self-consciously Anglo-Americans themselves. So I have a feeling that may have factored in a little bit, because it kind of reined in some of the antagonism that had otherwise existed between the American political establishment and Britain.
It's also worth mentioning that in the from 1917 onwards, there was an American battle squadron which joined the Grand Fleet. So I think it was 6 battleships, 5 or 6, and so there was an American bit of the Grand Fleet, but it was very much a minority. I see what you're saying. But the point was, the Americans made it very clear before the Washington Conference and during it that there was going to be no Anglo-American alliance. They made that very clear.
Well, I mean, that's kind of implicitly what's being agreed to, though, because maybe Britain would have hoped that they could have extracted some kind of alliance, even if it's a sort of de facto alliance, out of it. And they obviously hoped for some other things going in as well. As you mentioned, with the financial troubles, there were hopes that America would relax some of the debt obligations or forgive some of the debt, which obviously in the end we know they didn't. But that was kind of
none of that happened. Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning. It's gone from my head now. Sorry, Aaron. I was going to say something to you, and I can't remember what it was now. What would you say to this American Anglophilia bit?
Oh, it's very much a real thing, and actually, there's very much pronounced Anglophilia among the US veterans of the First World War. And during the period of the Irish War of Independence, there were various incidents in the United States where IRA, though there was a strong sort of Irish lobby supporting the IRA and Irish independence, there were attempts during sort of remembrance services to get sort of Irish Republicans represented, and the US veterans organisations were stridently opposed to this because they regarded Britain as their wartime ally, and the IRA as, because of the East Rising of 1916, effectively traitors to the Germans. And so that sort of that Anglophilia among Americans was something that was certainly felt among the veterans of the First World War, especially in the army, not so much, from what I can remember, among the US Navy, partly because, of course, the US Army is the thing that's mostly doing fighting in World War One, not necessarily the Navy. I can just ask Duke Valentino's answer that question. No, he wasn't. He left the Admiralty after Gallipoli.
He was sacked. He was sacked after Gallipoli.
Yeah, and he is, at the time of the Washington Treaty, he is the Colonial Secretary and also Secretary for State for the Air, which means he was in charge of the RAF at that point. But no, he didn't have any at that point. He didn't have any when the conference was going on. He was not. He did not have any special sort of power when it came to the Navy. He was just a member of the cabinet, a senior member, but still a member of the cabinet. And the decisions around the naval conference and the subsequent treaty are very much handled, and decisions being made by Lloyd George and, to a lesser extent, Balfour as his sort of man on the ground in Washington during the conference itself.
I remember what I was going to ask you now, Aaron. Billy Hughes, we were talking about the Australian Labor Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who was Prime Minister after World War One and during World War One. And although he was a Labor Prime Minister, he was actually a big-time Empire loyalist and a good Prime Minister. He's about the only Labour Prime Minister I will ever say was a good Prime Minister was Billy Hughes. And Billy Hughes actually said, before the Washington Naval Conference took place, if we can replace the Japanese alliance with an American alliance, that's okay. But if we can't, we should keep the Japanese alliance. And he was entirely correct, in my opinion. But I'll ask you, Aaron, and Rupert, what you think about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think Sir Robert Baldwin, the Canadian Prime Minister, or I can't remember if he was Prime Minister at this point or not. He was the Conservative leader in Canada. He was also quite critical of the idea of breaking off the Japanese alliance as well. Though that was as much based in traditional Canadian fears of the United States as it was for a sort of empire defence. But yeah,
and let's be honest about this. Up until the mid 1930s, the Americans had a war plan to fight the British Empire and involved invading Canada. So the Canadian Prime Minister wasn't wrong about that.
No, quite the opposite. He was quite right. That was a war plan red that the Americans had, and the Canadians knew about that quite early on, and they actually had their own equivalent to deal with an American invasion. In fact, there was a Canadian army officer who, during the 20s and 30s, essentially skated along the Canadian border in eastern Canada, sort of around New York State and that, looking where the Canadians could act. And so that those fears that Borden had were justified in terms of the sort of Canadian fears about the American encroachment. And Billy Hughes is an interesting man. He'd be a great subject for a future history stream, Duke.
Love to. Aaron, if you or Rupert or anyone else is interested in doing Billy Hughes, absolutely. As I say, he's the only Labour Prime Minister in any Anglo country that I have any time for whatsoever, because he was a pretty based guy who always saw the trees without being mixed up by the wood.
A man who he was very much that's true, Duke. He was also a man fascinating by the fact of how many different political parties he went through in his lifetime, especially even the sort of last 20 years of his life, from the 20s up until the 40s.
But any comments, Rupert?
Yeah, you just reminded me of the fact that, yeah, when it comes to because around, as we've sort of implied, around this whole issue of the Washington Naval Treaty is Britain trying to pick a side between Japan and America, who sort of everyone knew was going to go to war, because that was the obvious antagonism that existed right from like the mid World War One, possibly even before onwards. Everyone kind of saw it coming.
Because of China, of course. Partly because of China, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, they were trying to fight it. Well, they were trying to vie for what's called influence over the Pacific in general. But yeah, and I can't remember what the actual organization was called, but there was an attempt to try and unify the empires, like the British Empire's foreign policies between all the various dominions, and that's one thing that Canada was very, very tough on, is that they really did not want to make an enemy of America. Therefore, they wanted Japan to be the enemy if they had to pick between one of the two of them, and Canada was really intransigent on that point, which, yeah, regardless of long-term whether it might have been a better idea to stick with the Japanese because of the consequences of breaking off that treaty. You know,
Yes.
It's kind of hard to imagine what the consequences would have been of the reverse if Canada was willing to, completely break ranks on that issue.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that obviously at one end of the world, you had Australia and New Zealand, who were obviously concerned about Japan if they were not a British ally. Whereas Canada, given its geographical position, really didn't care that much about Japan, because Japan was not going to be a threat to Canada under any circumstances, really. So I think that is worth pointing out. And when you look at the Imperial Federation plans, as Steve says in the chat, yeah, that was one of the difficulties. Aaron, you're a political guy who's into this era. What's your take on the differences between the Canadian Dominion's fears and hopes and the Australian and New Zealand Dominion's fears and hopes?
I think that's generally correct what Rupert said, and it is very much a matter of the fact that the Canadians had the Americans on their doorstep and the Australians and New Zealanders didn't, and also the Japanese had during World War One pushed for, I can't remember what it was, like they sent a set of demands, about 15 points to the Chinese, and if the Chinese had accepted it, this was sent about 1915, 1916. China would effectively become a Japanese indirect colony, essentially.
Parts of it, to be fair, Aaron.
Yeah.
China is such a big country. It was only parts of it, but yeah, I take your point.
And that really angered the Americans, and also the Americans before World War One had difficulties with the Japanese over immigration, and Teddy Roosevelt had come to an agreement with them after the Russo-Japanese War, but sort of anti-Japanese feeling within the United States was very strong even before the First World War, and so that led to the Canadian view of things and not wanting sort of to set the Americans off.
Fair enough. All right, let's move on to the Washington Naval Treaty itself. And I think that the essential point to understand, and we're going to do a counterfactual later on in this stream, but to start with, we're going to do the actual Washington Naval Treaty. And the thing to realize is that in 1922, the Royal Navy had 42 dreadnoughts and dreadnought battleships and dreadnought battle cruisers. The American Navy, which was the second largest navy after the Royal Navy at that stage, because the German Navy had sunk itself, which was that was the most ships the German Navy ever sank, was when they sank their own ships. after World War One, after they surrendered to the Royal Navy. The American Navy was the second biggest navy in the world by quite a long way, and it had 21 dreadnoughts. And other than that, I think the Japanese had about 12 in 1922. And then the French and the Italians had, 6, 5, 4, that sort of numbers. And nobody else had any, basically, apart from a couple of South American nations that didn't really count for much, who had, 2 or 3. So you basically have Britain with 42 modern battleships, the Americans with 21, and everybody else with not all that many, apart from the Japanese, who I think had about 12 in 1922. And then they decide to have this conference, which is going to limit naval armaments. Now, I still don't know why the British government agreed to this. I think it was a complete mistake. Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister we've been talking about, said, if Britain can get America as an ally, then we can drop Japan. But if we don't, then we should stick with the Japanese alliance. And of course, if Britain has 42 battleships and the Japanese have 12, they may have had 15, I can't honestly remember now, but it was something like that. That would give the British-Japanese alliance something like 55 against the Americans' 21. Why then do you agree to scrap over half the Royal Navy and give up command of the world's oceans in 1922, which is what the British government did? With no war. They just agreed and did it.
So I think the argument goes that the American economy and American shipbuilding capacity was going to be able to eclipse Britain.
Hang on, Rupert. It might have, ultimately it could have. But in 1922, Britain could build 6 battleships a year if she chose to do so. The Americans could build 3 at the most in 1922.
Yeah, but financially speaking, America was in a much better place. So Britain did not want to get into.
Again, we've been speaking about this since we started. Britain was not in the best condition after World War One, but it was by no means skin.
Sure, but in that context, they want to avoid, cut the possibility of a naval arms race off before it gets started.
But if you're the British Empire, you depend on command of the world's oceans, and as soon as you don't have it, you are dependent on the goodwill of your enemies or potential enemies, including the USA.
Well, the hope was that by bringing the Americans on side with the Washington Naval Treaty, which was seen as a concession to the Americans, that it was
it absolutely was. It was scrapping half the Royal Navy. Yeah,
exactly. That therefore, as you said, the second largest naval power would be someone who they could rely on. And I should say there's a lot. That's why I've been going over the.
But it wasn't true, Rupert. It never eventuated that way at all. But
we know that now.
Okay. Well, I think people should have.
There were also some.
Then, but okay. Sorry, mate.
What's
carry on. Carry on.
I was just going to say there were also some consequences that they knew would be coming down the pipeline, which were a bit difficult to deal with in terms of things like if they'd stuck with the Japanese, then the Japanese were starting to be more strict in their demands for opening of immigration, basically. So although Australia and, to my knowledge, Australia and New Zealand were pretty ambivalent about the issue of just purely in terms of who they side with in the Pacific context between Japan and the US, they really, really did not want the inflow of Japanese immigrants, which Japan was kind of demanding as a condition of continuing the alliance.
That's news to me, Rupert, to be honest. That Japan wanted to have loads of immigrants going into Australia or New Zealand, that's total news to me. I've never seen that before. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I haven't seen it. But all right. But even so, I don't think it would have been large numbers. And Australia and New Zealand already had legislation in place to stop immigrants from China, for example.
Yeah, and that's the point, is that Japan wanted those relaxed so that the Japanese could enter.
But if Britain had said no and Australia and New Zealand had said no, I don't think that would have broken the Anglo-Japanese naval alliance, to be honest with you.
Well, fine, maybe not, but it was enough.
I know it was something they wanted, but I don't think that the Japanese didn't have anything to hold over Britain, Australia, or New Zealand to make them agree to that. They could have just said no. I mean, well, that leverage. The Americans had a very strong anti-Japanese policy.
Yeah, so in that context, Japanese leverage is the fact that Britain's basic strategy was to try and leave the defense of the Pacific largely to whoever they ended up allying with in the Pacific. So,
but it wasn't. Rupert. We were talking before you joined us. We were talking that they sent Admiral Jellicoe all around the Pacific, to Australia, to New Zealand, to Singapore, to India, and all the rest of it. And the British policy was actually to build a big fleet base in Singapore, and if a war broke out in the Far East, we were going to send half the British fleet, which at that stage was enormous, to Singapore. That was the whole point of building up the Singapore base. It became more of a nonsense when the Washington Naval Treaty eventuated, because the Royal Navy was a shadow of itself by then. But in 1920 and 21, that was the British policy, was to build a big fleet base at Singapore where half the Royal Navy could go and be supplied and repaired and anything else they needed. So yeah, I don't see, like, Japan might have wanted Britain and Australia, etc., to take more immigrants, but there was no way they could force us to do so. And her interests were absolutely to retain the British alliance, because the British alliance meant that America couldn't attack her, basically.
I mean, a big part of the reason for the significance and the Japanese attachment to the alliance is the fact that it was legitimizing them as a co-equal Western partner, which is basically what they wanted since Meiji. But having those discriminatory immigration practices was basically spitting in the face of that, and that is one of the major things so that in combination with the breakdown of the alliance with Britain, obviously, is what really delegitimizes the pro-Western factions of Japanese imperial government and kind of hands everything over to the nationalists.
Yep. No, I see what you're getting at. Aaron, what's your view on this stuff? Because I know this is your period in history that you're into. So
yeah, but I certainly have heard that the Japanese wanted sort of relaxation on immigration rules, but I don't think they would have got that. But also, I don't think it would have broken the alliance, because the Japanese, Rupert mentioned it, the alliance was sort of legitimizing Japan as a power on the world stage, and
especially as a great power, yeah,
and as an empire. And even after the alliance is broken in the 20s into the 30s, the British are actually supportive of Japanese policy in China, particularly northeast China, because the British would rather see northeast China under Japanese direct or indirect rule rather than under the control of a unified Chinese government, out of fears of that unified China threatening British interests in China, particularly Hong Kong. And so I think that the British, that this would have been that the immigration issue would have been a hurdle for the Franco-Japanese relations, but I don't think it would have caused an end of the alliance. I think the end of the alliance was very much a choice of the British, not so much a choice of the Japanese.
Oh no, it wasn't. I mean, the Japanese were mortified when the British broke the alliance, because as far as they were concerned, the alliance with Britain had, as both of you chaps have said, the alliance with Britain was what made Japan a legitimate great power in the early 20th century, and the Japanese were mortified when the British broke it. And I don't think for 1 second the Japanese would have broken the alliance over immigration quotas. I just don't, because the Japanese were realists. And I think the big issue here was actually that America had a much different idea of what should go on with China, for example, than Britain did. As Aaron just pointed out, like, Britain was quite happy for bits of China to be run by Japan, whereas the Americans weren't at all. Which was, just one of the many, many issues where British national interest was not in alignment at all with American national interest. It wasn't an alliance at all. It wasn't in alignment at all, which again, in my opinion, is why the Washington Naval Treaty was the biggest disaster the Brits went into after World War One. It began. You can say World War One began the end of the British Empire, but if you wanted to put the nail in the coffin, it was the Washington Naval Treaty. Like in 1900, Britain could pretty much do what it liked anywhere in the world, except in North America, I suppose. But by 1922, that was very severely constrained, and it was constrained because Britain had surrendered. To my mind, the whole point of this stream, to my mind, is the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty was Britain surrendering to America without a fight. That's my view of it. It was Britain surrendering to America without the least fight. We just gave in, and we surrendered command of the world's oceans, which was essential for the British Empire. In 1921. The British Royal Navy had enough warships that we could control all the world's oceans. And if we got into a war with, say, America, we could sink them if they came out. In 1923, we couldn't do that anymore. But Rupert, Aaron, you give your views.
One thing I would say is I think there's a I take issue with the idea that, especially at this time, that the Japanese are realists. I don't think they really were at this time. They were quite focused on the optics and the status that came along with the idea of being considered a co-equal Western partner. I mean, this is why their basic. So obviously they take the various Chinese possessions that they capture early in World War One and all of the outlying islands from Germany and everything. But the big thing that they want out of the Paris treaties after World War One is recognition of equality, like equality between the races, basically. Obviously, that's not that's basically struck down. No one else agrees to do that, but I think that's basically the perspective that they're coming from at this time. And so, yeah, I do think that the immigration thing would be quite a sticking point. I mean, I agree to disagree on that, but I think treating it for them as a realist prerogative is not appropriate to how they saw it. I don't think they were thinking about it in particularly strategic terms.
I still don't think they would have broken the Anglo-Japanese naval treaty over it, to be honest with you, Rupert.
Well, we weren't going to see them as equal, whereas that was basically
no. I entirely get what you're saying, and I know that's true. It is true, and they were disappointed about that stuff, but they weren't going to break the Anglo-Japanese naval alliance over it. They weren't.
I mean, to give an example as to how idealistic and perhaps naive they were at this time. Obviously, in retrospect, we consider the takeover of Korea to be basically just an annexation by the Japanese government, straightforwardly, and the Koreans as a subordinate.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah, as a subordinate party in the in that whole arrangement. But there was a sizable minority of the proponents to the annexation or to the union that wanted it to be that despite all of the circumstances around which it happened, they wanted the Koreans to be co-equal partners in a union state.
Yep.
So yeah, I don't think they were being cynical about this, or at least a
large
segment of the
it didn't happen.
Like Western Europhiles in particular. But that's obviously the faction that decisively loses out during this time period. So we kind of forget about them.
No, fair enough, Rupert. And I know you're correct. There were Japanese who wanted that, but of course that's not what happened. The Koreans ended up being second-class Japanese at best.
Yeah, of course.
As did the Taiwanese as well. But fair enough. But I know you're correct about that. What's your thoughts on this stuff, Aaron? Which is like we're getting a bit esoteric and political. But what do you think about this stuff?
I think the main motivations for the treaty itself are, at least from the British point of view, they tend to foster the American alliance post-war, getting on the good side of the Americans in terms of the debt renegotiation payments, and also the not wanting a naval arms race, partly because of the anti-war feeling, but also their sort of retrenchment at home. So that's pretty much why the British do it. And when it comes to the Japanese alliance, I agree with you, Duke. I don't think they would have broken the alliance, but I do actually agree with that the immigration issue would have been a sticking point in Anglo-Japanese relations. It would have been one that would have been overcome. I don't think it would have ended the alliance itself. It would have been a difficulty, but one that both sides could have overcome eventually at some point in the mid to late 20s.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, Aaron. I mean, look, the end result of the Washington Naval Treaty is the Royal Navy goes from 42 dreadnoughts to 15, and the American Navy goes from 21 dreadnoughts to 15. So basically half the Royal Navy is scrapped. And from 1922, the British Empire basically existed on the goodwill of the Americans, who were not our allies, and still had war plans to invade Canada. That's the end result of it, which to my mind makes it quite clear that it was a very bad treaty for the British to sign. I mean, given especially after World War I, the Americans went back to isolationism. And John Best in the chat says, was there a competition between the now massive British Army from World War I and the Royal Navy? No, after World War I, there wasn't, mate, because the army was disbanded very quickly. And the Royal Navy was always huge because Britain is an island nation, and at that time had a worldwide empire, and it depended on the Royal Navy. So the army was disbanded quite quickly after World War I, whereas the Navy was still huge until the Washington Naval Treaty, at which point the British government says to the Americans, the British Empire now depends on your goodwill, even though the Americans didn't really like the British Empire. And of course, all those pigeons came home to roost in World War II.
I mean, to be fair to people at the time, Anglophilia was much more in ascendant at the time in America.
Not for long, though, Rupert. Not for long.
Into the 30s, I think, at least.
It did. Maybe. I'm dubious about that. But I'm a Billy Hughes supporter, and Billy Hughes said, "Give me an American alliance, and I'll chuck away the Japanese. But if you can't chuck away, if you don't get an American alliance, then I want the Japanese alliance." And Billy Hughes was damn right, to be honest, as far as I'm concerned. Aaron?
Yeah, I think it was a mistake. That Britain, as you say, gave up its naval supremacy. Though I do think it was made for the reason I mentioned, in the hope of particularly a post-war alliance and the debt negotiation, the negotiation over debt repayments, and they were, in a way, you can see their intent was good, but they were completely misguided in believing that they would ever get what they wanted from the Americans. So it's, as I say, I agree with you, it was a complete mistake.
Yeah, that's my view entirely. Okay, we said we were going to do a counterfactual here, so let's do our counterfactual. Now, in 1921, the Royal Navy had a plan to build 4 enormously powerful battleships with 18-inch guns, and 4 enormously powerful, they were called battle cruisers, but they were actually battleships, but fast, with 16-inch guns. And they would have outclassed any warships in the whole wide world at that time. And my opinion is that the US Congress was no way going to allow the American Navy to even try and compete. I think the US Congress would just have said no. But you guys can say what you think, because we said we'd do a counterfactual, and this is a counterfactual. No 1922 Washington Naval Agreement, and instead Britain just does what she always did and just says, okay, we'll outbuild you. And bear in mind, Britain can build 6 battleships a year, and in 1922 the Americans can build 3 at the most.
Yeah, what I think would have happened is you would have had a naval arms race, which would have had 2 parts. One would have been the Anglo-American arms race, which the British would have won, partly because the British had their traditional support for maintaining the large navy, whilst in the United States, as you say, the Congress, particularly with the Midwest opposition to naval expansion, would have sort of lost. At the same time, the other part of this naval race would have been between the Americans and the Japanese, and the Japanese would have won. And significant portions of those, I would say all of those ships would have been built, the Japanese would have been built by the British, and so the British would have been financially better off in many ways for this. And also there would have been Canadian and Australian participation. The Canadians would have done it out of fear that the Americans would, because of the Americans' attempt to build up their navy. So you would have had a larger Royal Canadian Navy, and the Australians and the New Zealanders would have joined in. Now with the three dominions, their naval expansion wouldn't have been particularly big, but it would have been, they still would have expanded further than they did anyway. And then when it comes to the Anglo-Japanese alliance, you would have had sort of the pro-British element of the Japanese government remaining in power. The British would almost certainly have supported the Japanese in their expansion in China in a more direct way. For example, I'm convinced the British would have very much supported the Japanese staying on in Shandong and keeping the Qings out, which they gave up in the late 20s under Chinese pressure, and I think also a bit of American pressure. And so you would have seen Japan remaining pro-British and also active in China throughout the 20s and 30s, but nowhere near as sort of they would have been far more realistic, I think, with the British there, supporting them in that sort of guiding them, as it were. And so they would have continued their expansion in China, but it would have mainly remained in the northeast of China. It wouldn't have been trying to, as the Japanese did do, particularly in the 30s, trying to annex all of China, conquer all of China, which they could never do. And so Anglo-Japanese relations would have been better. The Americans would have been...
China was too big for Japan to annex entirely.
Yeah, and I think that the Anglo-American relations would have taken a hit, but then by the 30s they would have been back to sort of normal, very much so.
But my other thing, before I ask Rupert to come in on this, my other thing is, if you're starting from a Royal Navy of 42 dreadnoughts, and you can build 6 a year, right? And the Americans are starting from 21 and they can build 3 a year at most. And all right, they can spend a load of money and build 4 a year then, you know? But that's only if Congress will do that. And I very much doubt they will. And then on top of that, you have the Japanese, who at this stage would have like 15 and would also be building a couple of battleships a year. And so you add the Japanese toll to the British toll, and the Americans just can't do much about it. They really can't. Unless the American Congress is suddenly going to like have a brain fart and, oh, yeah, all right, we're going to spend all our money on the US Navy, which they never will traditionally do. Could the Americans overtake the Brits? Sure. But I mean, even in real world terms, the American Navy only became bigger than the Royal Navy in 1944. You know, even in real history terms, leaving aside our counterfactual. And also bear in mind, one of the things the Washington Naval Treaty did was, because no one could build battleships for years after the Washington Naval Treaty, Britain was allowed to build 2 because we wanted a couple of 16-inch gunships. So we built Nelson and Rodney, one of which sank Bismarck, by the way, but and was a more powerful ship than Bismarck. But one of the things the Washington Naval Treaty did was half the shipyards in Britain shut down because we weren't building warships anymore, which of course meant that in the 1930s with the Great Depression, more people were out of work, and you know, it affected the British economy really badly. But without that, all those shipyards keep going, and we keep building at least 4 or 5 battleships every year, which Britain had been doing since, I don't know, probably about 1870, you know? So yeah, you've also got to look at that. Rupert, what's your view on this counterfactual stuff?
I think the raw economics aren't going to allow that necessarily, because, well, if only because the well, by its nature, a battleship or a dreadnought is not a productive asset. So if you get into a naval arms race, the difference is, although Britain might have greater capacity, America can make those ships comfortably, whereas Britain is going to struggle a lot more. It's going to take a lot more of the budget, which is stretched a bit thinner. So potentially that puts Britain in a lot more debt when when economic troubles come along, if they're going to try and maintain that throughput. What else? I can envision a scenario where even if Japan... okay, so to go back a little bit, Japan's pro-Western faction, like you could call them like Europhile liberals, they are not humiliated in the same way as they are historically. But I can envision a scenario where the opposite is basically true. So whereas in America, the Anglophiles are vindicated by the Washington Naval Treaty, essentially, instead, the Anglophiles are basically repudiated in that case. And that kind of thing is sort of why Canada is so cagey about the idea of hostile relations with America or siding against America. I don't know what consequences that has on the grand project of Imperial Federation, because that was only really taken up sort of half-heartedly over the period up until quite late on. But potentially it means that Canada starts to pull away and chart their own path a little bit more, especially in terms of foreign policy. And they potentially either get closer to America or they are more antagonistic with America. And I don't know that there's a scenario where the US actually invades Canada, but in this kind of time period, but it's a lot more of a tangible threat than it was in our time period, in our history. I don't know to what extent Japan still does try to go for expansion in China, not least because the factions that were pushing to do this militarily and were pushing for antagonism in China were the sort of more nationalist chauvinist types. So with them, they wouldn't be fully checked because they had such a large presence in the army. But some of the influence networks would be more diluted by the fact that, especially the civilian government, would not be quite as humiliated as they were in our timeline. So they potentially have a bit more of a leg to stand on when it came to trying to resist the impulses of the nationalist factions. So yeah, potentially you don't see the same level of Japanese expansionism happening. Certainly not against the European powers. They still had the same animosity against the Soviets that they had historically, so perhaps they'd be more inclined to push their focus towards the north instead. If, however, something like the Marco Polo Bridge incident still happens, and Britain instead tries to mediate on Japan's side fundamentally to try and extract concessions from China without it escalating to a more full-scale war, then that's kind of a scenario where America and Britain end up coming to blows. I don't really know what the overall result of that would be, but it would definitely hurt Britain's economy quite a bit, even if it just grounded into a basically a stalemate after Canada falls. What else?
That's fair enough, Rupert. If Canada falls, I'd say, because I'm not sure it would, given the American army is tiny. And if you're looking at a Royal Navy, which alongside the Japanese is more than twice as big as the US Navy, the US has got a really big naval problem as well, like along both their coasts. Can they invade Canada? Yeah. Given how small their army is, I'm not sure they can win, though, to be honest. I mean, given how wild most of Canada is, and much of the American border along that area is also pretty wild. I mean, in 1812, the Americans invaded Canada 3 times and totally failed in every invasion. I think you could easily see that situation happening. Would it cause a bad stuff to the British economy? Yes, probably. But when you say like building dreadnoughts is like not a productive thing to do, bear in mind running those shipyards with all those workers in those shipyards building those ships actually does provide an economic boom to the areas around those shipyards, as it always had for the Brits.
It does, but it's not producing a productive asset in the economic sense. So
no. I see what
has,
you're saying. Of course I do. But the point I'm trying to make is that like all those workers building those ships are getting paid, and they are in turn supporting all the local businesses around them. You know, whether they be grocery stores or ironmongers or whatever the hell they might be, or plumbers or electricians or whatever. You know,
I know what you mean, but
yeah,
you would get effectively the same result if you just gave them the money to do no work.
but you wouldn't, because at the end of the day, Britain can fight America.
Sure, but I'm talking strictly economically.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah,
strictly economically.
I see your point.
You don't get
no,
but
I do see your point.
It's not like a good to be sold or a good to be used to, or just like improving the productive capacity in any particular way. So,
but the British shipyards were the most efficient and best shipyards in the whole wide world. That's why the Royal Navy, as I said earlier, many times could build 6 battleships a year and also build 1 or 2 for other powers at the same time. And in the 1920s, all that was shut down because of the Washington Naval Treaty. And in the very late 1930s, when Britain was trying to rearm, half of these shipyards were shut, and it was no good. We couldn't do it. Because once you shut them, you can't reopen them.
Echoes of the situation that America finds itself in now.
But anyway,
to
some degree, true.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Washington Naval Treaty didn't preclude Britain from, say, manufacturing some more of these ships and sending them elsewhere, right?
No, it did actually. Yes, you weren't allowed to build ships for anyone else.
Okay,
that's one of the points of the treaty.
And
again, I think it was an insane treaty for the British government to agree to. I think that Britain should have built the N3s and the G3s and said to the US Congress, you want to spend that money, boys, go for it. And I don't think they would have done, to be honest. I really don't. The US Congress would have said no.
Well, by the same token, Parliament would have been quite reluctant to build a lot of ships if it was coming.
No. You're misunderstanding me. I'm talking about if you have a British government which is pro-British rather than Lloyd George, who was pretty anti-British, to be honest. He was probably the original anti-British prime minister. You know, during the Anglo-Boer War, he was like, "I want the Boers to win," basically.
Well, by the same token, we'd be talking about a scenario where the US in general is a lot more anti-Britain. So
good.
Building more
ships
to oppose Britain would be probably not very controversial.
But if Britain had twice as many battleships as America, I wouldn't really care if America was any British, because we can sink their ships.
It's a long-term difficult proposition, though, considering America by this point is, by a fair margin, the largest economy in the world.
Partly, but it's nowhere near the biggest shipbuilding nation in the world. Nowhere near in 1922, man. Not even close.
Yeah, but they've got the capacity to improve their shipbuilding capacity. And,
if they spend billions and billions and billions on that, rather than other things. Yes.
But that's exactly the same situation that we would be in, having to spend all of that money.
No, Britain had always done this, Rupert. Britain didn't need to do anything she hadn't been doing for the past 70 years.
But she was a lot poorer now.
But she wasn't a lot poorer. That's the point I'm trying to... We talked about this at the beginning of the stream and you missed some of it. But yeah, Britain was poorer, but not a lot poorer. You know, not a lot. Britain was not anywhere close to bankrupt in 1918 or 1919. Not even close. It was... Everyone does this. They think Britain at the end of World War One was something like it was at the end of World War II, and it wasn't. Britain in World War II was basically a bankrupt nation from 1943. We were a military colony of the Americans from 1943. But World War One, it was nothing like that at all. And Aaron and I talked about this at some length at the start of the stream. Britain could easily afford to build 6 battleships a year, and it wouldn't have bankrupted us or done anything bad, really. And the American Congress were never going to allow the American Navy to do that, because in 1922, the American Congress was basically isolationist. You know, they just weren't going to do it. And they never really cared about the American Navy. This was something that only happened towards the end of World War II, to be honest.
Well, once again, I think this is something that is aided by the fact that the Anglophiles are in the ascendant, so they don't feel like they have anything to particularly worry about or be concerned about overseas.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with you on that, but okay, it's a point of view. Aaron, what do you think, mate, about this counterfactual we're in at the moment, where the Brits say to the Americans, "Well, okay, do your worst"?
Yeah, I think there would have been the Anglophile would have lost power, but in reality, after the Naval Treaty was signed, there were elements within the Republican Party who were quite Anglophobic, who weren't pleased by it. They thought it was a mistake to limit American naval power, which is what they regarded as well as. And so you would have had certainly a strong push for shipbuilding, which as you say, Duke, the Americans didn't have the same capacity as we did, and also in Britain we had an established political argument for it, which was we needed to defend the empire and defend the shipping lanes, whereas the Americans didn't have that, and there was considerable opposition within the United States, particularly within the Midwest, which was also at the time solidly Republican. We should just explain that since 1920 there was a Republican in the White House, and from 1920 to 1921 to 1933, you had a solid Republican government a solid Republican rule in the White House and to a degree Congress, and so you would have had an attempt to do a naval race with the British and the Japanese, but it would have failed because the Americans, particularly the solidly Republican voting Americans in the Midwest and in the sort of centre of the country, what is now referred to as the flyover states, would not have been particularly happy about paying for an expanding navy, which they didn't see a point of. They wouldn't have been pro-British, but they wouldn't have seen the point of expanding the navy when, as I said previously, they've got 2 large oceans which protects them from invasion, and
there was never any chance of Britain invading America. That was not going to happen. Yeah. Every American knew that. But also understand, in 1922, you got 42 British dreadnoughts, plus another 12 to 15 Japanese dreadnoughts. So you're talking about 55 and the Americans have 21. That's a hell of a lot of catching up to do when you can only build 3 in a year. Now, all right, the Americans can spend billions and billions, and after they spend billions, and after, say, I don't know, between 5 and 10 years, they might be able to build 6 ships themselves, but they've still got to catch up with other fleets which are more than twice as big as them. It's a ridiculous argument, in my opinion. They're just not going to do it. You know, people always say before World War One, oh, German industry was like outdoing Britain in this and that and the other, but they were never even close to matching Britain in terms of building warships. And America was in exactly the same position. The one thing Britain could do supremely well in the early 20th century was build warships quicker than anybody else. We had the best shipyards with the most skilled people working in them. And they were so damn good, we could build a revolutionary battleship from keel laying to launch in under a year. No other nation in the world could do that. No other nation in the world could do that, including the Americans. The first American dreadnoughts had reciprocating engines because the Americans couldn't put turbines in them. Same thing with the Germans, by the way.
I mean, in this scenario of an arms race, though, a naval arms race, the Americans are obviously going to prioritize shipbuilding. You know, possibly not to the same degree as actively during World War II, but you know, considering how quickly they got production going then,
even then,
they could still do it pretty quickly.
Even then, Rupert, they didn't overtake the Royal Navy until late 1943. Even in World War II. So in the 1920s, and as I keep trying to tell you, and everyone listening, Britain lost half its warship building capacity because of the Washington Naval Treaty. If you don't have that, then Britain keeps all those shipyards open. And no one could outbuild the British. It was impossible in 1922 for anyone, including America, to outbuild the British. It wasn't possible.
Another thing to bear in mind, though, is that quite a lot of the debt was the national debt of Britain was being held by Americans, which
I know
they would call back. They would call that back in, and they would not be issuing more debt in a antagonistic scenario.
But they did call it back in anyway, and we've spoken about this, Rupert. You might have missed it, mate, but we spoke about this before you came on. America had British debt, like Britain had debt from France and Belgium, and much of it didn't get paid. But the point is, the Americans did exactly what you're saying anyway. Made no difference.
No, they didn't. They refinanced it.
No, they didn't. Not really.
They didn't. They didn't like take the money at the end of the term and then just refuse.
But the point is, they couldn't take the money. How could they take it?
Well, again, in the context of at the end of the term, where the money is due to be paid.
How could any nation force another nation to pay debt back then?
I mean, the greater point is that would be a bankruptcy of that would be a British bankruptcy, which is obviously a major economic problem.
But they couldn't do it, Rupert, is the point I'm trying to make. How?
They could. Okay, well, there were still national assets either in the US itself that they could basically
Oh
just
yeah, they
compensate
were.
as.
Yeah, and you know as well as I do that in 1941, all of those were sold off at knockdown prices to American companies. You know that. I know that.
Yes.
Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
You know, the same as they sent a US cruiser to South Africa in 1942 to take the very last British gold reserves. Yes, absolutely. But in 1922, they couldn't do any of that stuff.
No, in 1922 they could easily they could easily confiscate the assets that they had access to if we're talking about a bankruptcy scenario. But also that's just devastating to Britain's status as a financial and economic power anyway. In general.
Yeah, but Britain could have also done that to the American assets in Britain. So in 1922, it would have been a pretty even playing field.
No, it wouldn't. Britain by that point, at that point, was not a creditor in relation to America.
I don't think you're entirely correct about that, mate. To be honest,
I mean, again, this might just be a point of agree to disagree, but I believe the consensus is basically that Britain would have gone bankrupt in World War I had it not been for American loans.
Aaron, what do you think?
I think that Britain would have had a hard time in World War One, certainly without American loans. But I do think, particularly because Britain in World War was willing to actually raise taxes, like the Germans, we could have survived. And I do also with the Americans, particularly post-war, there is the situation where if the Americans pull the plug, they're pulling the plug on everybody else. Because if they pull the plug on Australia, they're going to pull the plug on the Germans, the French, and the others. And so I don't think the Americans would have done that purely because they could see the blowback on the entire economy would have been the global economy, which they relied on. Because, of course, the reason why America has such a bad time during the Great Depression is the fact they can't export anything to anybody because nobody's buying anything. And the Americans would not, I don't think, have pulled the plug, even in this situation, because it would have backfired on them so badly.
I really don't think they're going to finance the shipbuilding program of Britain with loans.
Sure, they're not, but they weren't anyway because the US basically didn't loan Britain fuck all between the wars.
No, they did keep refinancing the debt
for a little, to an extent, but not really, Rupert. I'm sorry, they didn't. I've looked at this a bit, and I'm no mathematician, but I've got to say that the American support of Britain in terms of money was minimal between the wars. It really was minimal.
I mean, I'm not suggesting that this was like some kind of favor or anything. It was purely transactional.
No, it wasn't.
But you lose, but they're losing the even the access to those financial markets, which at this point is basically the only major crediting nation.
No, I don't agree with you about this, Rupert. I'm sorry, I just don't. I think the Brits could have turned around and told America to get stuffed in 1919, and it would not have really hurt the empire that much. That's my own opinion. I think if push had come to shove, we could have said that, and it would have harmed us to some degree, but it would have harmed the Americans as well. And there were also American assets that Brits could have seized if it had come to it as well.
No one knows much.
If you're really into a trade war at that stage, the British Empire was much more equal to America in 1922 than it was in 1942, for example.
I mean, yes, of course, but just in absolute terms, I think this is going to be an agree to disagree, but I think you're talking about a major financial crisis at this point. That is probably not going to be affecting other countries to the same extent, because they would still have access to American money markets and whatever. And yes, it would hurt America in other ways as well. But
Yes.
I think you're kind of talking about relative isolation of the British economy, which it couldn't really sustain.
And
who knows? Maybe that would be okay. To carry the idea a bit further, maybe that would have been good in some other ways, because it would have really pushed the empire into a corner when it comes to imperial federation.
Would have. Yep, it
But,
would have.
Yeah, I think it still would have been very painful.
Well, I'm not saying it wouldn't have been painful, but I think we might still have come out at the other end of it better than we in fact did, given that by 1943, Britain was a bankrupt nation, which was basically a military colony of the US. Why not try our luck 20 years earlier when we had a much stronger economy? That would have been my point of view. I hate these people who think all Americans are bad, but the American government's always hated the British government, and has always worked against the British government. And it's only twats like Churchill who think it hasn't. That's my opinion. Aaron, what do you think, mate?
Yeah, I think the United States, for all the Anglophobia that was going on at the time, was, I would say, not necessarily hostile, but simply had interests that were at odds with those of British interests, and there was an element of Anglophobia, especially interesting among Republicans. But you also had sort of strong Anglophobia among sort of northeastern Republicans, from the sort of the Cabot lodges and the WASP establishment around Roosevelt and Taft. But
I detest Franklin D. Roosevelt, by the way.
Oh no, I mean Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, Teddy Roosevelt, yeah, he was an okay guy, but Franklin D. Roosevelt was a scumbag. If you're British,
Yeah, and so there were both Anglophile and Anglophobic elements to American politics at the time, depending on which ethnic group you spoke to. So the Irish and the Germans, for reasons you can understand, were certainly not pro-British. But there was also, as you previously mentioned, the Anglo-American group that were pro-British. Interestingly, the most pro-British part of the United States at the time and throughout, I believe, the 20th century was the Deep South, which was also slightly democratic.
The bit that the Royalists settled in the 1600s.
Yeah.
But no, absolutely. I still think Britain made a mistake in the American Civil War, and Britain should have come in on the side of the South, which might have let them won. But there's a counterfactual we could do one day. If the British Empire backs the South, the Confederacy, that might be interesting to do as a counterfactual, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would certainly have supported the South. I mean, Robert E. Lee and all those guys were, they were good guys as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, gentlemen, any final thoughts? Rupert?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of anything else to add that hasn't already been mentioned. I think.
Or would you like to plug anything, Rupert?
No, not in particular at the moment. I'm not really. I don't really have anything upcoming. Not doing that much online at the moment. Maybe the only thing would be the Pendragon Roundtables. I'm appearing on that stream with Nathan Hood and a couple of others.
Oh, Nathan's really good. Well, please say what channel and when and all that, Rupert?
Yeah, I believe the channel is Pendragon Roundtables, streaming on there once a month, just about like talking about various media.
Cool. Nathan Hood is a really good guy. And also, guys, check out Rupert August's channel. He's a really good chap. Does some good history streams and stuff like that. So if he's doing stuff with Nathan, excellent. Go and check that out. Thanks, Rupert.
Well,
That's cool.
Not really streams on my channel, but I've got some essays about various things, and monarchy at the moment, and I'll be hoping to get back to that at some point, but I don't really want to plug it too hard because I don't know when I'll be able to really get back into the swing of that. At some point.
That's all right. You're a new dad, mate. You're allowed. But yeah, excellent. I'm really glad you came on here this evening. Yeah, good stuff, mate. Aaron, anything you want to plug or final thoughts?
Well, my final thoughts is that I agree that it was the Washington Naval Treaty was a complete mistake and disaster for British policy. When it comes to plugging, I will probably at the weekend be putting out my review of HMS Surprise by Patrick O'Brien. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it.
Cool. Really good book. Really good book.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I should say that this is a reread for me. I have read through the Aubrey Maturin books once before, but it was quite a long time ago. So, but I am really enjoying the reread. And so the review of that will be out sometime at the weekend, and then sometime next week, I'm not sure when, myself and Duke will be doing a live stream discussing HMS Surprise.
Looking forward to that, Aaron. That's one of my favorite historical novels. I mean, it's loosely based on Thomas Cochrane's action in the Mediterranean, but yeah, it's a great book. It'd be good.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you, by the way, Aaron. I think the Washington Naval Treaty was a disastrous thing for the British government to agree to. It basically gave up control of the world's oceans without a fight, without a building race, without anything. We just said to the Americans, we surrender. And Britain's been doing that ever since, if you ask me. We keep surrendering to the Americans. And don't get me wrong, I have many American friends. I have American military friends I've fought alongside who are brave as fuck. I know beautiful American women. I just don't like the fucking government, to be honest. Excuse my language, excuse my French, but it's their government I don't like. Not American people who are often great. But their government, nah, I got no time for them. I don't even like Trump all that much, but he's better than everyone we've had recently. So that's good, I guess. All right, I'm going to play us out with a tune. If it will bloody well play, we'll see. Let's see if it does. We'll see if this plays. It might, I don't know.
Cheer up, my lads, 'tis to glory we steer, to add something more to this wonderful year. To honor we call you as free men, not slaves, for who are so free as the sons of the waves, hearts of all our ships, jolly stars on our men. our foes, but we wish them to stay. They never see us, but they wish us away. If they run while we follow, and run them ashore. For if they will fight us, what can we do more? Hearts of oak are our ships, jolly tars are the men. We always are ready, steady boys, steady. We fight and we conquer again and again. We'll still make them feel and we'll still make them flee, and draw them on shore as we draw them at sea. Then cheer up, and as within one heart let us sing. Oh, soldiers and sailors, our statesmen and king, hearts of oak are our ships, jolly tars are our men. We always are ready, steady boys, steady. We fight and we conquer again and again.
Well, there you go. That was Hearts of Oak, which is the official march of the Royal Navy. Shouldn't be anymore because there's too many women in it, but sadly, that is still, well, not sadly, that's still the official march of the Royal Navy. I just wish it was a more military organization these days. Thank you very much to my guests, Aaron Hook, and especially to Rupert August, who hasn't been around for a long time. Really nice to see you back, Rupert. I'm a big admirer of Rupert August. He does a lot of good stuff. And so does Aaron. There will be links to their channels under the stream later on. And thanks, guys. It's 8:37 in the morning here, and I've been up all night, so I'm going to sleep soon. So take care, and we will see you on Saturday. Hang on, let me just quickly check that we didn't get any entropy charts. No, we did not. There we go. So I did check it, guys. If we did, I will talk about them on the next stream. So don't let the bastards grind you down. Come and join us on Saturday evening, same time as this show, for our politics and current events stream. Go well, and thank you very much again to my guests.